When people think of the Gilded Age, they imagine marble staircases, champagne towers, diamond tiaras, and parties so extravagant they feel almost unreal. But behind the glitter and spectacle was something deeper and far more obsessive. The Gilded Age was not just an era of wealth. It was an era of men trying to outbuild time itself, and no project captured that ambition more completely than Hearst Castle. Before we begin, if you enjoy deeply researched historical documentaries that uncover what really happened behind the wealth, power, and illusion of America's most extravagant eras, make sure to subscribe. New stories are released regularly, and each one explores history far beyond the surface. High above the Pacific Ocean, on a remote hilltop along California's rugged central coast, rises a structure that feels strangely out of place. Its towers resemble Spanish cathedrals. Its terraces evoke ancient Rome. Its interiors are filled with ceilings older than the United States itself. This is Hearst Castle, officially known as La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. It was never meant to be just a home. It was designed as a stage, a theater of power, a private kingdom where the richest and most influential people in America gathered not simply to relax, but to be seen. Hearst Castle became the ultimate party palace of the Gilded Age's long afterlife, a place where Hollywood stars swam beneath Roman statues, politicians dined beneath medieval tapestries, and newspaper headlines were quietly shaped between courses of dinner. But behind the beauty lay staggering cost, relentless construction, and an obsession so consuming that the castle was never truly finished. This is the story of the wildly expensive dream behind the Gilded Age's ultimate party palace. By the early 20th century, America had entered a new phase of wealth. Industrial fortunes had exploded beyond anything previous generations had known. Railroads, steel, oil, mining, and media had created men whose personal wealth rivaled small nations. These men built mansions not merely to live in, but to declare dominance. The Gilded Age mansion was not about comfort. It was about message. William Randolph Hearst understood this instinct better than almost anyone. As the most powerful newspaper publisher in the country, Hearst controlled public opinion on a scale never seen before. His papers reached millions daily. His headlines influenced elections, shaped wars, and destroyed reputations. But influence on paper was not enough. Hearst wanted a physical symbol of permanence, something that would outlast headlines and printing presses. He had seen that symbol as a child. Born into sudden wealth after his father struck silver and gold, Hearst grew up surrounded by privilege, but guided by a mother who believed culture mattered more than money. Phoebe Apperson. Hearst exposed her son to Europe's greatest artistic treasures while he was still young. Castles, cathedrals, palaces, and ancient ruins left a permanent mark on him. These buildings had survived centuries. Kings had come and gone, but stone endured. When Hearst returned to America, he carried a quiet conviction. Someday, he would build something that felt just as eternal. The opportunity arrived after his mother's death in 1919. Hearst inherited vast stretches of California ranch land overlooking the Pacific. Among those acres was a hilltop he remembered from childhood camping trips. It was isolated, dramatic, and commanding. The perfect location for a dream unconstrained by practicality. At first, Hearst described the project modestly. He wrote to architect Julia Morgan, saying he wanted to build a little something on the hill because he was getting too old to sleep in tents. But this was not humility. It was the opening move of a decades-long architectural obsession. Julia Morgan immediately understood the scale of what Hearst envisioned. The hilltop had no roads, no water, no electricity, and no infrastructure of any kind. Everything would need to be built from scratch. Materials would have to be hauled up steep terrain. Workers would need housing. Power would need to be generated on site. Water would need to be piped from miles away. Most clients would have retreated at the cost alone. Hearst did not hesitate. Construction began in 1920, and from the very beginning, expense was not a limitation. It was a feature. Roads were carved into the mountainside. Water systems were engineered across miles of rugged land. Diesel generators powered the hilltop long before public utilities reached the area. Entire work camps were built to support the labor force. Hearst insisted on reinforced concrete construction to withstand earthquakes, but then covered it in imported stone and marble, so the structure looked ancient rather than modern. And this was only the foundation. Hearst Castle was never designed as a single building. It was conceived as an entire complex. At its center would stand Casa Grande, the main house, rising like a European cathedral above the clouds. Around it would sit guest houses, gardens, pools, terraces, and courtyards. Every element was meant to impress. Nothing was meant to be subtle. The cost of materials alone was staggering. Hearst scoured Europe for architectural fragments, ceilings, doorways, fireplaces, tapestries, statues, and entire rooms from dismantled palaces and monasteries. These were not replicas. They were original pieces, some hundreds of years old. They were shipped across the Atlantic, transported by rail, and hauled up the mountain piece by piece. Often, Hearst bought artifacts without knowing where they would go. He would present them to Julia Morgan and ask her to fit them in. She did, again and again. Over the course of nearly 3 decades, Morgan produced more than 10,000 drawings for the project. Plans were revised constantly. Walls were moved. Rooms were expanded. New ideas replaced old ones, overnight. What was finished one year might be redesigned the next. The castle grew not according to a master plan, but according to Hearst's evolving imagination. By the mid-1920s, even as construction continued, Hearst Castle was already functioning as a social hub. Hearst and Marion Davies, his longtime companion, began hosting guests long before the project was complete. The unfinished state did not matter. In fact, it added to the mystique. Guests arrived by train from Los Angeles, then traveled by car through miles of private ranch land. Along the road, they encountered something entirely unexpected. Exotic animals grazed beside the drive. Zebras, giraffes, antelope, and kangaroos roamed the hills. Peacocks wandered freely. Hearst had created a private zoo, not hidden away, but integrated into the landscape as part of the spectacle. By the time guests reached the hilltop, they had already entered another world. At the heart of the estate, Casa Grande rose higher each year. 6 stories tall, crowned by twin bell towers, it dominated the horizon. Inside were more than 100 rooms, including libraries, dining halls, galleries, bedrooms, a private theater, and indoor swimming pool. Every space was filled with art, not curated for cohesion, but accumulated with passion. The dining room alone rivaled a medieval hall. A single table stretched nearly the length of the room. Tapestries lined the walls. Carved choir stalls from European monasteries served as seating. And yet, the food served was famously simple. Hearst preferred hamburgers, fried chicken, and steak. Guests dined like royalty, but ate like Americans. The parties themselves were meticulously controlled. Dinner was mandatory. Conversation was expected. Alcohol was limited. Schedules were enforced. Hearst ruled his estate like a newsroom, with discipline and routine. This was not chaos. It was controlled spectacle. Perhaps the most famous symbols of the castle's excess were its pools. The Neptune pool, built outdoors on a grand terrace, resembled an ancient Roman bath. Marble columns framed the water. Classical statues lined the edges. The pool was heated year-round, allowing guests to swim beneath the sun or stars. It became one of the most photographed locations in America. Inside Casa Grande, the Roman pool offered an entirely different experience. Covered in more than 1 million glass mosaic tiles in blue and gold, it shimmered like a jewel box. Underwater lighting made the space glow from within. It was less a pool than a temple to excess. Hollywood embraced the castle completely. Movie stars, directors, writers, and studio executives became regular guests. Politicians followed. Foreign dignitaries visited. Deals were made quietly over breakfast. Headlines were influenced subtly. Hearst Castle was not just a party palace. It was a center of informal power. And it was wildly expensive. The cost of maintaining the estate was enormous, even by Hearst's standards. Hundreds of staff members worked full-time. Gardeners, cooks, electricians, caretakers, drivers, and artisans kept the illusion alive. Art continued to arrive. Construction continued. There was always something new being added, revised, or improved. Even when the Great Depression struck in 1929, Hearst refused to stop. As businesses collapsed across the country, he continued spending. He believed his empire was too large to fail. He believed his dream was worth any cost. It wasn't. By the mid-1930s, Hearst's finances were unraveling. His newspaper revenues declined. Loans mounted. Creditors grew nervous. Eventually, banks took control of his assets. Construction at Hearst Castle was halted in 1937 with a single order. Tools were dropped. Workers left. Blueprints were rolled up. The ultimate party palace fell silent. Hearst never returned to live there again. What remains today is not just a mansion, but a monument to an era when wealth chased immortality through stone. Hearst Castle represents the final, extravagant echo of the Gilded Age mindset, a belief that enough money, art, and ambition could build something permanent in a world defined by change. Visitors still walk its terraces. They still marvel at its pools, its towers, its endless rooms. But beneath the beauty lies a quiet truth. The dream cost more than money. It consumed decades, strained fortunes, and outlived the man who built it. The ultimate party palace was never truly about parties. It was about legacy. What made Hearst Castle different from every other Gilded Age mansion was not simply its size or cost, but the way it blurred the line between private life and public theater. Other tycoons built palaces to retreat from the world. Hearst built one to pull the world toward him. Every detail of life on the enchanted hill was engineered to create a sense of controlled wonder. Guests did not wander freely. They were guided, subtly but firmly, through a sequence of experiences designed to impress, disarm, and awe. From the moment they arrived, the estate told them a story about power, taste, and inevitability. Hearst was not just wealthy. He was unassailable. Mornings at the castle followed strict routines. Hearst slept late, so the household slept late. Breakfast waited until he was ready. Guests learned quickly that the schedule revolved around one man. There were no exceptions. This was not rudeness. It was hierarchy. Afternoons were spent swimming, riding, walking the gardens, or simply talking. Conversation mattered deeply to Hearst. He surrounded himself with writers, journalists, politicians, and thinkers. Ideas were currency. A clever remark could earn favor. A dull presence could lead to quiet exclusion from future invitations. Even leisure served a purpose. Hearst Castle was, in many ways, an extension of Hearst's newsroom philosophy. He believed in shaping reality rather than merely observing it. Just as his newspapers crafted emotional narratives to guide public opinion, his castle crafted emotional environments to guide personal relationships. Guests left feeling grateful, impressed, and subtly indebted. That influence reached far beyond Hollywood. Politicians understood the value of a weekend at San Simeon. Invitations were not automatic. They were signals. A dinner at the long table meant proximity to a man who could elevate or destroy reputations with a headline. Conversations held beneath medieval tapestries often echoed months later in editorials across the country. And yet, despite the grandeur, there was an underlying tension at the heart of the estate. Hearst Castle was never finished because Hearst himself was never satisfied. Each completed room sparked a new idea. Each terrace suggested another extension. The dream expanded endlessly, fed by insecurity as much as ambition. To stop building would have meant admitting the dream was complete, and completion terrified him. Julia Morgan understood this better than anyone. For nearly 3 decades, she balanced Hearst's boundless imagination with engineering reality. She solved problems quietly, methodically, and without recognition. When Hearst demanded towers inspired by Spanish cathedrals, she ensured they could withstand earthquakes. When he insisted on ancient ceilings, she reinforced them with modern support hidden from view. She absorbed his changes without complaint. Sometimes entire sections were redesigned after completion. Walls moved, staircases reoriented, materials replaced. What would have been considered wasteful madness for most clients became routine at San Simeon. The cost of these revisions was immense, but Hearst rarely acknowledged it. Money, to him, was simply fuel for vision. But time was not as forgiving. As the 1930s progressed, the mood at Hearst Castle began to change. The Great Depression reshaped the country, and the contrast between suffering below and luxury above the clouds grew impossible to ignore. Hearst's newspapers struggled financially. Advertising revenue declined. Loans tightened. For the first time, the man who had built an empire on confidence faced limits he could not bully away. The parties grew smaller. The guest lists shortened. The laughter softened. The castle still dazzled, but something essential had shifted. The sense of inevitability was gone. Marion Davies felt this shift acutely. For years, she had been the heart of the castle's social life, effortlessly charming guests and smoothing over tensions. But the weight of constant performance took its toll. Her drinking, once dismissed as indulgence, became more noticeable. Hearst tried to control it quietly, limiting alcohol at dinners and monitoring supplies, but the strain of isolation and public scrutiny never fully lifted. Their relationship, though deeply affectionate, existed within boundaries neither could escape. Hearst remained legally married. Davies remained unofficial. In a world obsessed with status, that distinction mattered. Still, she stood by him when others drifted away. When banks finally seized control of Hearst's assets in 1937, it was not just a financial collapse, it was a personal humiliation. The man who once dictated national narratives now needed permission to spend. Construction at the castle was halted immediately. Workers left the hill. Tools were abandoned where they lay. The silence was devastating. Hearst never formally said goodbye to the castle. He simply stopped going. Whether from pride, exhaustion, or heartbreak, he could not bear to see his dream frozen mid-thought. From afar, he requested photographs. He studied them quietly, as if willing the place to finish itself. The ultimate party palace had become a monument to excess paused in time. During World War II, the castle remained largely dormant. The nation's focus shifted toward survival, sacrifice, and global conflict. Hearst, aging and weakened, withdrew further from public life. His influence waned. His empire shrank. But the castle endured, unchanged, waiting. When Hearst died in 1947, news of his passing spread through the very newspapers he once controlled. Editorials debated his legacy. Visionary, tyrant, genius, manipulator. But one truth was undeniable. No one before or after him had attempted anything quite like Hearst Castle. After his death, the estate stood as a question rather than an answer. Too large to inhabit, too expensive to maintain privately, too historically significant to demolish. Eventually, the Hearst family donated the property to the state of California, transforming a private obsession into a public monument. Today, visitors walk through spaces once reserved for the powerful and famous. They marvel at the Neptune pool. They stand beneath ancient ceilings. They listen to stories of weekend parties that feel unreal by modern standards. But what lingers most is not the glamour. It is the sense of longing embedded in the stone. Hearst Castle is beautiful, but it is also restless. It feels unfinished, not because construction stopped, but because the man who built it never found what he was truly searching for. The Gilded Age promised that enough wealth could conquer time, secure legacy, and silence fear. Hearst believed that promise completely. The enchanted hill stands as proof of both the ambition and the illusion. It is the ultimate party palace of an era that believed excess was eternal, and the quiet reminder that even the wildest dreams eventually reach their limits. What Hearst Castle ultimately revealed was not just the scale of one man's ambition, but the psychology of an entire era struggling with permanence. The Gilded Age had been built on speed. Fortunes appeared almost overnight. Railroads cut across continents in years. Cities rose in decades instead of centuries. Wealth arrived faster than meaning could keep up. For men like William Randolph Hearst, this speed created anxiety. If wealth could be created so quickly, it could disappear just as fast. The answer, in his mind, was stone, marble, towers, something that moved at the pace of history rather than markets. Hearst Castle was his attempt to slow time. Unlike earlier Gilded Age mansions that were finished within a few years and then occupied, San Simeon never settled. It remained a work in progress for nearly 3 decades. That constant construction mirrored Hearst's own restlessness. Completion would have meant acceptance. Acceptance that there was nothing left to add, nothing left to chase. Even at its peak, the castle functioned less like a home and more like a controlled environment. Guests stayed for weekends, sometimes weeks, but rarely longer. Staff rotated constantly. Nothing was allowed to grow casual. Familiarity was the enemy of spectacle. This was intentional. Hearst understood that mystique required distance. The castle had to feel rare, elevated, slightly unreal. The moment it became ordinary, it would lose its power. And so, even as guests laughed, swam, and dined beneath chandeliers, the experience remained curated. Every interaction reinforced hierarchy. Hearst sat at the head of the table. Conversation flowed toward him. Opinions mattered most when they aligned with his. Disagreement was tolerated, but never encouraged. This was not democracy. It was monarchy with modern plumbing. And yet, for all its control, Hearst Castle was also deeply personal. Every piece of art reflected Hearst's tastes. Every architectural reference traced back to a memory. Spanish towers echoed cathedrals he had seen as a boy. Italian ceilings reminded him of his mother's lessons about culture and refinement. The libraries reflected his belief that information was the ultimate currency. The castle was not just a display of wealth, it was a map of his inner world. That made its financial collapse even more painful. By the time construction stopped in 1937, Hearst had spent the equivalent of nearly $1 billion modern dollars on the estate. That figure did not include the cost of the art collections filling warehouses across the country. Many items he purchased never even made it to the hilltop. They remained crated, stored, and forgotten. The dream had outgrown its container. Banks took control not because Hearst lacked assets, but because his wealth was illiquid. He was asset-rich and cash-poor. The castle consumed resources without generating income. Newspapers, once wildly profitable, now struggled in a changing media landscape. Hearst had built permanence in a system that rewarded adaptability. The irony was cruel. The man who revolutionized journalism by understanding public emotion failed to recognize the emotional shift of the country itself. America was moving toward restraint. The age of grand private palaces was ending. Public scrutiny of wealth was increasing. The mood had turned. Hearst Castle, once a symbol of aspiration, began to feel out of step with the times. Yet even as the world changed, Hearst could not let go. He refused to sell the estate, refused to dismantle it, refused to repurpose it. San Simeon was not negotiable. It represented his life's meaning more than any newspaper empire ever had. Losing control of his business was humiliating. Losing the castle would have been unbearable. Instead, he let it freeze. Caretakers remained. Gardens were maintained at minimal levels. Rooms stayed furnished but unused. The estate became a preserved memory rather than a living space. Its silence grew heavier with each passing year. Marion Davies remained his constant during this period. While others distanced themselves, she stayed. When banks restricted his spending, she quietly supported him financially. When public opinion turned colder, she shielded him emotionally. Her loyalty was unwavering. History often portrays Davies unfairly, reducing her to a caricature shaped by Citizen Kane. In reality, she was perceptive, generous, and deeply self-aware. She understood the cost of loving a powerful man whose public identity consumed everything around him. At San Simeon, she was not merely a guest or accessory. She was the emotional center. Staff respected her. Guests gravitated toward her warmth. She softened the edges of Hearst's authority. Without her, the castle would have felt colder. When Hearst withdrew from public life after Citizen Kane, it was Davies who absorbed the emotional fallout. The film did more than criticize Hearst. It rewrote their story for the world. The fictional portrayal painted her as talentless and shallow, a depiction that wounded her deeply. Hearst raged publicly. Davies suffered quietly. The castle, once alive with laughter, now echoed with absence. By the 1940s, the Enchanted Hill felt like a relic of another century. While war reshaped the world, the estate remained unchanged. Its grandeur no longer aligned with national priorities. Even Hearst seemed to understand this. He stopped speaking of expansion. He stopped dreaming aloud. When he left the castle for the final time in 1947, there was no ceremony, no announcement, just a departure. He never returned. After his death, the question of the castle's future lingered uncomfortably. The Hearst family respected its significance, but understood its impracticality. No individual could realistically inhabit it. No private budget could sustain it long-term. The estate demanded either transformation or surrender. The decision to donate it to the state was both pragmatic and symbolic. What had begun as a private assertion of dominance became a public inheritance. The castle shifted from a personal dream to a collective artifact. In becoming a museum, Hearst Castle lost its exclusivity but gained permanence. Visitors today encounter a space suspended between eras. The rooms remain furnished as if guests might return at any moment. Chairs sit empty. Tables remain set. The illusion of activity lingers, even in stillness. What they walk through is not just architecture, but ambition made physical. Hearst Castle stands as the final and most extreme expression of Gilded Age thinking. It captures the belief that wealth could outpace mortality, that beauty could anchor legacy, that excess could shield against irrelevance. It also captures the flaw in that belief. The castle survived. The parties did not. The headlines faded. The empire dissolved. What remains is the stone, carrying the weight of dreams heavier than it was ever meant to hold. In that sense, Hearst achieved exactly what he wanted. He built something unforgettable, something that refuses to disappear, something that still commands attention long after the world that created it has passed. But the cost was staggering, not just in money, but in time, in obsession, in unfinished longing. Hearst Castle is magnificent. It is also cautionary. It reminds us that even the wildest, most expensive dreams cannot freeze time. They can only leave behind echoes. What makes Hearst Castle linger in the imagination is not only what was built, but what was never resolved. The estate stands today as a completed structure and an incomplete idea at the same time. Every tower is finished, every room furnished, every terrace polished for visitors. Yet the vision that drove its creation was left suspended, cut short by forces Hearst believed he could always outrun. To understand why the dream collapsed, it is necessary to look beyond architecture and into the economic reality of the Gilded Age mindset itself. The men who built America's great fortunes believed scale was protection. Bigger companies, bigger estates, bigger influence. They assumed that growth itself created safety. Hearst applied that same logic to his castle. As long as it kept expanding, as long as it remained in motion, it could not fail. The project became a symbol of momentum, and momentum felt like control. But control was an illusion. Hearst's wealth was vast, yet fragile. It depended on advertising revenue, public trust, and credit markets that could change overnight. When the Depression exposed those vulnerabilities, the castle became a liability instead of a shield. Every added room increased maintenance costs. Every imported artifact increased debt. Every delay increased pressure. The Enchanted Hill was built as if money were permanent. History proved otherwise. What is often overlooked is how unusual Hearst Castle already was by the time construction stopped. Most Gilded Age mansions had begun their decline decades earlier. Families sold them, subdivided them, or demolished them. Servant-dependent estates no longer made sense in a world with rising labor costs and shrinking fortunes. Hearst Castle, however, defied that pattern by sheer force of will. It survived because Hearst refused to let it go. Even when he lost control of his businesses, even when banks imposed oversight, even when public opinion shifted, he clung to the castle as the last domain where his authority felt absolute. That stubbornness preserved it. In a strange way, the same obsession that nearly ruined him also saved the estate from the fate of so many others. Hearst Castle was never chopped into apartments. It was never sold off piece by piece. It was frozen whole. When the state of California took ownership in 1958, it inherited something rare. A Gilded Age estate still intact, still furnished, still carrying the psychological imprint of its creator. The transition from private palace to public museum was carefully managed. The goal was preservation, not reinvention. Rooms were left largely as they had been. Art remained where Hearst placed it. The illusion of occupation was maintained. Visitors were not meant to see a ruin. They were meant to step into a paused world. That choice has shaped how Hearst Castle is understood today. Unlike many historic sites that feel distant or academic, San Simeon feels emotionally present. The spaces feel inhabited, even when empty. Chairs face one another. Books rest on tables. Bedrooms look as though their occupants simply stepped out. This atmosphere creates an uncanny tension. People expect grandeur, but they also sense loss. The castle does not celebrate triumph. It radiates absence. That absence is central to its power. Hearst believed legacy came from accumulation, more art, more rooms, more scale. Yet the lasting impact of the castle comes not from how much it contains, but from what it represents, the moment when accumulation stopped working. The Gilded Age promised that wealth could solve every problem. Hearst Castle quietly disproves that promise. For all its beauty, the estate did not bring peace. Hearst died far from it. Davies lived out her life elsewhere. No heir took up residence. The castle never became a family home. It remained a stage without actors. That outcome was not inevitable, but it was likely. Hearst built the castle for performance, not continuity. It functioned perfectly when he was present, directing the experience, controlling the narrative, shaping the mood. Without him, the system collapsed. There was no structure for succession, no emotional ownership beyond the man himself. In that sense, Hearst Castle mirrors the empire that financed it. The newspapers flourished under Hearst's direct control. After his decline, they fragmented. Influence faded. The system depended too heavily on a single will. The castle was the same. And yet, despite everything, the dream succeeded in one critical way. Hearst wanted to be remembered, not as a publisher alone, not as a politician, but as a builder of something that transcended his lifetime. On that measure, he succeeded more completely than most of his peers. His contemporaries built mansions that vanished. He built one that became immortal. But immortality came with reinterpretation. Today, Hearst Castle is no longer a symbol of power. It is a symbol of excess. It is studied as a cultural artifact, not admired as a model. Visitors do not leave wanting to replicate it. They leave contemplating it. That shift matters. The Enchanted Hill now tells a different story than Hearst intended. It no longer says, "This is what greatness looks like." It says, "This is what obsession builds." And that may be its most honest legacy. The castle captures the moment when ambition tipped into overreach, when the desire to last overwhelmed the ability to adapt, when scale became burden instead of advantage. It also captures something deeply human. Hearst was not chasing luxury for comfort. He was chasing permanence for reassurance. He wanted to believe that if he built something large enough, beautiful enough, old enough in appearance, it would anchor him against uncertainty, against aging, against irrelevance. The tragedy is that no building, no matter how grand, can do that. Yet there is also something undeniably beautiful in the attempt. Hearst Castle stands today not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a monument to the intensity of human imagination. It is the physical record of a mind that refused to think small, even when thinking big carried consequences. It reminds us that history is shaped not just by success, but by excess, not just by triumph, but by obsession, not just by what endures, but by what was risked to make it endure. The ultimate party palace of the Gilded Age was never really about parties. It was about fear of disappearance. And in turning that fear into stone, William Randolph Hearst ensured that he would never completely vanish, even if the world he tried to freeze in marble inevitably moved on without him. If Hearst Castle feels emotionally heavier than other monuments of wealth, it is because it exposes a contradiction the Gilded Age never resolved. The era celebrated individual vision, but it depended on collective systems. Fortunes were personal, but their survival required cooperation, stability, and restraint. Hearst rejected restraint entirely. His castle was the logical extreme of an age that rewarded expansion without asking where it led. By the time Hearst Castle entered the public imagination as a museum, the world that produced it no longer existed. The United States that emerged after World War II valued efficiency, modesty, and mass accessibility. Suburbs replaced estates. Television replaced newspapers. Influence shifted from singular magnates to corporate systems. In that context, the Enchanted Hill became an artifact from a vanished mindset. Visitors often arrive expecting spectacle. What they encounter instead is scale without intimacy. The rooms are magnificent, but they do not feel warm. The corridors impress, but they do not invite lingering. Even the most beautiful spaces carry an undertone of distance. That distance was intentional. Hearst did not want comfort, he wanted awe. Comfort encourages familiarity. Awe enforces hierarchy. The castle was designed to remind everyone inside it who held power. Yet power, when preserved too carefully, becomes brittle. Hearst Castle could not evolve because it had been built to declare a final statement. Unlike homes that grow organically over generations, this estate grew according to a single will. When that will weakened, growth stopped entirely. There was no next phase. This is why no billionaire has ever replicated Hearst Castle. Not because it cannot be afforded, but because it cannot be justified. Modern wealth is optimized for liquidity, flexibility, and public optics. A structure like San Simeon ties capital to permanence. It demands maintenance without return. It attracts scrutiny rather than admiration. In the Gilded Age, excess signaled legitimacy. Today, it invites suspicion. Hearst built his palace at the precise moment when that signal was losing its effectiveness. He was the last man powerful enough to attempt it, and the last to believe fully in what it represented. The cost of the dream is often calculated in dollars, but the deeper cost was psychological. Hearst poured his identity into the estate. When the castle stopped growing, so did his sense of forward motion. Without construction, without expansion, without guests, the hilltop became a reminder of limits rather than possibilities. That is why he could not return. To walk those halls unfinished would have forced him to confront the truth he spent his life avoiding, that even the largest vision reaches an edge. Marion Davies understood this instinctively. After Hearst's death, she did not attempt to reclaim the castle. She did not fight for it. She did not try to preserve the fantasy privately. She let it go. In doing so, she demonstrated a wisdom Hearst never fully embraced. She lived with memory rather than monument. That contrast defines the emotional legacy of the estate. Hearst Castle is remembered more vividly than Hearst himself. The building eclipsed the man. In trying to outlast time, he ensured that stone would speak louder than ink. Ironically, this is the opposite of his original power. As a publisher, Hearst controlled narratives. At San Simeon, the narrative escaped him. The castle tells its own story now, one that cannot be edited or revised. It speaks of ambition uncontained, of imagination unchecked by consequence, of a belief that enough beauty could silence doubt. It also speaks of discipline, craftsmanship, and astonishing human effort. Thousands of workers built something extraordinary in an impossible location. Julia Morgan translated fantasy into engineering with precision unmatched in her era. Artifacts that might have been lost were preserved through obsession. The legacy is not simple. Hearst Castle is neither triumph nor failure alone. It is a convergence of both. It stands because of excess, not in spite of it. It survives because one man refused compromise. It endures because obsession, when sustained long enough, leaves marks that practicality never does. Yet the silence remains. When visitors stand at the terrace overlooking the Pacific, they feel it. The wind moves through the cypress trees. The marble reflects light without warmth. The pools shimmer without laughter. Everything is intact, and yet something essential is missing. That absence is the final cost of the dream. The Gilded Age promised that wealth could create meaning. Hearst Castle quietly answers that promise with restraint. It shows what happens when meaning is pursued through accumulation alone. When vision outruns balance. When permanence is mistaken for fulfillment. The ultimate party palace was never really meant to host endless celebration. It was meant to host permanence. And permanence, as Hearst discovered too late, does not guarantee peace. What remains on the enchanted hill is a question carved in stone. How much is enough? How big is sufficient? When does ambition become burden? Hearst Castle does not answer those questions directly. It simply stands, watching the Pacific as it has for decades, allowing each visitor to draw their own conclusion. In that way, the wildly expensive dream behind the Gilded Age's ultimate party palace achieved something unexpected. It stopped trying to impress. It began to reflect. What Hearst Castle ultimately exposes is the fragile boundary between ambition and overextension. In the Gilded Age imagination, ambition was treated as a moral good. To build bigger was to prove worth. To dominate landscapes was to confirm destiny. Wealth was not simply money, it was validation. Hearst absorbed this belief completely, then carried it further than anyone else dared. By the time San Simeon reached its peak, the castle no longer reflected contemporary taste or necessity. It reflected a worldview already slipping into history. The United States was moving towards scale without spectacle. Corporations replaced individuals. Systems replaced personalities. Influence became diffuse rather than concentrated. Hearst Castle stood in direct opposition to that trend. It insisted on individuality in an age drifting toward anonymity. It insisted on permanence in a culture accelerating toward disposability. It insisted on hierarchy in a society beginning, however imperfectly, to question it. That insistence is why the castle feels almost defiant, even today. The enchanted hill was never meant to blend into its surroundings. It was meant to dominate them. Rising above fog and coastline, its towers were designed to be seen from miles away. Visibility mattered. Hearst understood symbolism instinctively. He built upward not for convenience, but for statement. Every guest who climbed the hill performed a ritual of ascent. The journey reinforced the message before a single word was spoken. Even the castle's isolation was strategic. Distance created anticipation. Remoteness created privilege. To reach San Simeon required time, effort, and invitation. That separation reinforced the idea that this place existed outside ordinary life. Inside, reality was suspended. Newspapers arrived daily, but the outside world felt distant. Crises unfolded beyond the hills, but within the estate, meals were served on schedule, films were screened, conversations flowed. It was a controlled universe, insulated from consequence as long as resources allowed. That insulation eventually failed. The collapse of Hearst's finances did not happen overnight. It came through accumulation, the same process that built the castle itself. Each loan, each expansion, each acquisition seemed manageable in isolation. Together, they formed a structure that could not withstand shock. The Great Depression was that shock. What is striking is not that Hearst fell, but that he believed he could not. His confidence was total. He had outmaneuvered rivals, crushed critics, influenced governments. Why should markets be any different? This belief in personal invincibility is a hallmark of the Gilded Age elite. Many shared it, few tested it so completely. Hearst Castle became the physical ledger of that belief. Each terrace added another line item, each imported artifact another obligation. The estate grew more impressive, even as its foundations weakened financially. By the time the reckoning arrived, reversal was impossible without destruction. Hearst could not downsize the dream. He could only stop it. That stopping point is frozen into the architecture. Visitors can sense where momentum ended. There are spaces that feel transitional, incomplete, unresolved. Corridors that lead nowhere. Plans that were never realized. Those absences speak as loudly as the finished rooms. They reveal a project halted by reality, rather than completed by satisfaction. The silence that followed construction's end was not just practical, it was emotional. Hearst withdrew because the castle no longer affirmed his narrative. It no longer symbolized ascent, it symbolized limitation. For a man who defined himself through expansion, limitation was intolerable. This is why the castle feels haunted not by ghosts, but by unfinished intention. The structure holds energy without release. It waits for a continuation that will never come. When the estate transitioned into public ownership, its meaning shifted again. No longer a personal refuge or power center, it became an object of observation. People no longer arrived to impress Hearst. They arrived to study him. The gaze reversed. The man who once watched the world now became the subject under scrutiny. That transformation carries irony. Hearst spent his life shaping how others were seen. In the end, he could not shape how he himself would be interpreted. The castle became the primary lens through which history remembers him. Not his editorials, not his campaigns, not even his scandals. Stone outlasted ink. This outcome underscores a paradox. Hearst built to control legacy, but legacy escaped his control. The castle speaks now in a language he never intended, emphasizing excess, obsession, and vulnerability more than triumph. And yet, it would be a mistake to view the castle only as failure. Hearst Castle also represents extraordinary human coordination. Thousands of workers contributed skill, labor, and creativity. Julia Morgan's engineering brilliance ensured the structure survived earthquakes, time, and neglect. Artifacts that might have vanished were preserved through obsessive collection. The castle stands because of human effort at a monumental scale. That duality is what makes it compelling. It is simultaneously awe-inspiring and unsettling. It commands admiration and critique in equal measure. It refuses simple categorization. This complexity reflects the Gilded Age itself. The era produced innovation and exploitation, beauty and inequality, progress and excess. Hearst Castle compresses those contradictions into a single site. Standing there, one does not merely see wealth. One sees belief systems made physical. The belief that visibility equals significance. The belief that accumulation equals security. The belief that permanence can be purchased. Each belief is etched into the stone, and each belief, tested by history, reveals its limits. Modern visitors often leave with mixed emotions. They marvel at craftsmanship. They question necessity. They admire vision. They sense imbalance. The experience resists easy takeaway. That resistance is the castle's enduring power. It does not instruct, it provokes. In an age still wrestling with extreme wealth and its consequences, Hearst Castle feels unexpectedly current. It raises questions that remain unresolved. How much space should one person occupy? How much labor should serve one vision? When does aspiration become excess? The Gilded Age answered these questions through expansion. History answered through collapse. Hearst Castle sits at that intersection. It is not merely a relic of past extravagance, it is a mirror held up to ambition itself, and like all honest mirrors, it reflects both grandeur and distortion. The wildly expensive dream behind the ultimate party palace did not end with fireworks or applause. It ended quietly, with tools set down and doors closed. Its legacy is not celebration, but contemplation. In the end, Hearst achieved permanence not by finishing his dream, but by leaving it unresolved. The castle endures because it captures a moment when ambition reached beyond its grasp and froze there, suspended between confidence and doubt. That suspension is what visitors feel today. Not envy, not desire, but recognition. a recognition that no matter how high ambition climbs, it eventually meets the limits of time. What lingers most powerfully about Hearst Castle is how clearly it reveals the emotional architecture of extreme wealth. Long after the financial numbers fade, long after the guest lists blur into legend, what remains is the psychology embedded in stone. This was not merely a residence or even a spectacle. It was a coping mechanism. Hearst did not build the enchanted hill to escape the world. He built it to control it. Every aspect of the estate reflects a desire to orchestrate reality. From the regimented schedules to the choreographed arrivals, from the curated art to the controlled indulgence, the castle functioned as a closed system. Inside its walls, uncertainty was managed. Outside forces were kept at bay. Chaos was filtered through marble and ritual. This impulse did not originate with the castle. It defined Hearst's entire life. As a publisher, he believed information could be shaped into power. As a collector, he believed beauty could be accumulated into meaning. As a builder, he believed permanence could be engineered. Hearst Castle was the convergence of all three beliefs. But systems built on control require constant input. They cannot pause without revealing fragility. When construction stopped, the illusion cracked. The enchanted hill was designed to feel timeless, but it was sustained by constant motion. Workers repairing, gardeners trimming, staff polishing, architects revising. Once that motion ceased, time rushed back in. Dust gathered. Silence amplified. The absence of activity exposed how much effort had been required to hold the dream together. This is why the castle feels emotionally charged, even when empty. It carries the residue of tension. Unlike ruins softened by decay, Hearst Castle remains immaculate. That preservation intensifies its emotional weight. Nothing distracts from the unanswered questions. Nothing dissolves into abstraction. Everything is present, intact, waiting. The rooms do not tell stories of family life. They tell stories of performance. There are few signs of spontaneity, few traces of disorder. The estate was never allowed to relax. Even joy followed structure. Even leisure followed schedule. This rigidity was not accidental. It was essential to maintaining the illusion of mastery. Yet mastery proved temporary. Hearst's withdrawal from the castle after construction stopped was not simply a matter of health or convenience. It was symbolic. To return would have meant confronting a version of the dream stripped of momentum, a palace without growth, a kingdom without expansion. That was not a reality he could inhabit. Marion Davies understood this instinctively. While Hearst clung to the idea of control, she adapted. After his death, she moved forward without attempting to preserve the world they had shared. She sold properties. She simplified her life. She let memory replace monument. Her response stands in quiet contrast to Hearst's. Where he sought permanence through stone, she accepted impermanence through memory. That difference reveals something essential about why the castle ultimately belongs to history rather than to a living lineage. It was built to sustain one vision, not a family, not a future generation. And so, it became a museum. Museums preserve objects, but they also transform them. Once private symbols become public questions. Once controlled narratives become open interpretations. Hearst Castle no longer tells guests what to think. It invites them to observe. This shift has softened neither the excess nor the contradiction. It has amplified them. Walking through the estate today, visitors experience a sequence of emotional reversals. Initial awe gives way to curiosity. Curiosity gives way to reflection. Reflection often ends in unease. The scale impresses, then it overwhelms. The beauty delights, then it distances. The luxury fascinates, then it exhausts. This arc mirrors the experience of the Gilded Age itself. At first, Expansion feels exhilarating. Possibility seems endless. Boundaries dissolve. Then accumulation accelerates beyond meaning. Scale eclipses purpose. What once symbolized success begins to feel hollow. Hearst Castle embodies that trajectory in physical form. It is tempting to frame the estate as a cautionary tale about excess, but that interpretation alone is incomplete. Excess is only part of the story. The deeper theme is substitution. Hearst substituted building for belonging. He substituted permanence for peace. He substituted accumulation for resolution. The castle did not fail because it was too large. It failed to fulfill its purpose because no structure can resolve the anxieties it was built to mask. This does not diminish the achievement. It reframes it. Hearst Castle succeeded architecturally. It succeeded artistically. It succeeded historically. It failed only at the impossible task it was given, to quiet the fear of impermanence. That fear is universal. Hearst simply expressed it at monumental scale. This is why the estate resonates beyond its era. Modern audiences recognize the impulse immediately, the desire to leave a mark, to build something that proves one mattered, to resist being erased by time. Hearst had the resources to act on that impulse in stone. Most people act on it in smaller ways: careers, families, creations, legacies. The castle magnifies a common human drive until it becomes undeniable. Standing on the terraces overlooking the Pacific, one feels the tension between ambition and humility. The ocean stretches endlessly. Waves erase their own footprints. The horizon remains indifferent. Against that backdrop, the castle feels both heroic and futile. That contrast is not accidental. Hearst chose the site deliberately. He wanted his creation to face something eternal. In doing so, he ensured it would always be measured against it. The Pacific does not compete with the castle. It absorbs it. This may be the most profound element of the Enchanted Hill. No matter how grand the structure, nature ultimately frames it, not the other way around. Fog rolls in, light shifts, time passes. The castle remains, but it does not dominate. In this quiet dialogue between stone and sea, Hearst Castle reveals its final truth. Permanence is relative. Legacy is interpreted. Control is temporary. What endures is not the certainty Hearst sought, but the question he left behind. And perhaps that is why the wildly expensive dream behind the Gilded Age's ultimate party palace continues to captivate. Not because it offers answers, but because it refuses to settle. It stands not as a conclusion, but as a pause in stone. What ultimately separates Hearst Castle from every other monument of wealth is the way it forces confrontation rather than admiration. Many historic estates invite visitors to imagine themselves inside the fantasy. San Simeon does the opposite. It places visitors inside scales so extreme that identification becomes impossible. You do not imagine living there. You imagine managing it, sustaining it, or escaping it. That reaction is not accidental. The estate was never meant to be lived in casually. It was meant to be operated. Hearst Castle functioned more like a private state than a home. It required logistics, labor coordination, and constant oversight. Water had to be pumped, power generated, supplies transported across miles of isolated terrain, staff schedules synchronized, repairs continuous. Nothing about the castle was passive. This operational reality reveals something crucial about Hearst himself. He was not chasing leisure. He was chasing mastery. Leisure implies rest. Mastery implies control. Hearst was uncomfortable with stillness. Even at the height of success, he needed motion. Newspapers updated daily. Headlines rotated hourly. Expansion never stopped. The castle mirrored this internal rhythm. As long as something was being added, revised, or refined, the system felt alive. When that motion ceased, the emptiness became unbearable. This is why the estate feels psychologically heavy. It is saturated with effort, but starved of rest. Every space reflects intention, but few reflect ease. The chairs are beautiful, but they do not invite slouching. The rooms are grand, but they do not encourage intimacy. Even the gardens feel curated rather than wild. The estate's beauty is disciplined beauty, controlled beauty, beauty that obeys hierarchy. That discipline extended to guests as well. Hearst believed hospitality was not generosity, but orchestration. He offered access, not freedom. Guests were welcomed warmly, but never allowed to forget where they were. Schedules were firm, expectations were clear, deviations were quietly discouraged. This created an atmosphere that was simultaneously luxurious and tense. Many guests adored the experience. Others found it exhausting. Few were indifferent. This polarization is another reason the castle endures in memory. It provokes reaction. It does not fade quietly into nostalgia. As years passed and Hearst withdrew, the estate began to reflect something else: absence without decay. Unlike abandoned places where nature reclaims space, Hearst Castle remained suspended in preservation. That suspension intensified its emotional impact. It is easier to romanticize ruins. It is harder to romanticize intact emptiness. The silence of the castle is not softened by collapse. It is sharpened by order. Everything remains as it was meant to be, minus the people. This creates a sense of interruption rather than closure. The story does not feel finished. That unfinished quality is not architectural. It is existential. Hearst Castle asks an unspoken question: what happens when the dreamer disappears before the dream resolves? In most lives, ambition softens with age. Goals narrow. Priorities shift. Hearst did not experience this transition naturally. External forces imposed it. The collapse of his finances, the loss of control over his empire, and the erosion of public influence forced an ending he never chose. The castle became the physical record of that forced ending. This is why it feels more personal than other historic estates. It captures a moment of psychological rupture. The dream did not conclude. It stalled. That stalling resonates deeply in a culture that still celebrates relentless ambition. Hearst Castle stands as a rare artifact showing what happens when ambition reaches its outer limit without finding resolution. It is not failure in the conventional sense. The castle exists. It stands. It functions. It attracts millions. But it failed to deliver what it was built to provide: peace. This distinction matters. Hearst did not build for enjoyment. He built for reassurance. He wanted proof that his life's momentum meant something permanent. When permanence arrived without reassurance, the dream lost its purpose. That loss echoes through the halls. Visitors often describe a strange emotional reversal during tours. The early rooms impress. The middle spaces overwhelm. By the end, many feel contemplative rather than exhilarated. The experience drains rather than energizes. This is not due to fatigue alone. It is psychological saturation. The castle gives too much. Too many rooms. Too much art. Too many references. The mind cannot absorb it all meaningfully. The abundance collapses into abstraction. This mirrors Hearst's own relationship with accumulation. At a certain point, quantity overwhelmed meaning. The act of collecting replaced the reason for collecting. The castle became a container that could never be filled enough to satisfy the impulse driving it. In that sense, the estate is less about luxury than compulsion. Compulsion to build, compulsion to acquire, compulsion to outlast. These impulses are not unique to Hearst. They exist wherever power intersects with insecurity. The castle simply magnifies them. This is why modern audiences find Hearst Castle unsettling rather than aspirational. Contemporary wealth culture favors visibility without permanence, experiences over monuments, flexibility over fixation. San Simeon represents the opposite philosophy. It demands commitment without exit. That demand feels foreign today. And yet, the castle's endurance gives it authority. It survived market crashes, cultural shifts, wars, and generational change. It absorbed reinterpretation and remained relevant. It refused to vanish. In that sense, Hearst succeeded in the narrowest interpretation of his goal. He built something that would not disappear. But endurance alone does not equal fulfillment. Hearst Castle remains because it is maintained, curated, and contextualized. Without those efforts, it would eventually deteriorate. Permanence still requires participation. The dream did not end because it was achieved. It ended because sustaining it became impossible without surrendering control. That surrender never came willingly. This is perhaps the most human aspect of the story. Hearst was not undone by lack of vision. He was undone by excess of it. He could not stop expanding long enough to consolidate meaning. The castle teaches that lesson without moralizing. It does not condemn ambition. It exposes its cost. Standing on the terraces today, looking out over the Pacific, one senses both triumph and futility. The view is breathtaking. The structure is astonishing. And yet, the ocean remains unchanged. The horizon remains indifferent. This contrast is the castle's final narrative device. Hearst built something meant to compete with time. Time responded by reframing it. The enchanted hill no longer speaks of conquest. It speaks of consequence. It reminds us that the Gilded Age did not end because people stopped dreaming big. It ended because the scale of those dreams exceeded the systems supporting them. Hearst Castle stands at that breaking point. It is the ultimate party palace, not because of its guests, but because of its ambition. It gathered the era's beliefs, values, and illusions into one place and let them expand until they could no longer sustain themselves. What remains is not an answer, but a presence that asks, quietly but insistently, what we expect our dreams to do for us once they stand complete, and whether we are prepared for the silence that follows.